Aussie larrikin who fleeced a major bank of more than $1.5 million, living the life of a high roller.
It's a pretty addictive thing to make sort of money appear from nowhere and be able to spend it.
Imagine you go to a bank ATM and discover a glitch in the system that allows you to withdraw unlimited funds. Money that's not even in your account. In such a scenario, the moral choice would be to report this glitch, right? But our story today revolves around someone who finds himself in this exact situation and makes a different choice. Tempted by the allure of instant wealth, he decided to exploit this loophole to amass a fortune, eventually becoming a millionaire. And we'll see how. In the end, his scheme is unexpectedly exposed, so make sure to watch it until the end. This story took place in 2011 in Australia, and the protagonist is a man named Dan Sanders, who lives in Melbourne, one of Australia's largest cities. Dan worked in a casino. Through his job at the casino, he met a woman who later became his fiancée. However, this woman moved to a smaller city in Australia named Wangaratta, with a population of about 30,000 people. Dan, being deeply attached to her, although they were not yet married, followed her and moved to the same city. Of course, he needed to find a new job to make a living. Initially, he moved between several jobs, sometimes as a cleaner and sometimes as a waiter, until he found work in a bar. One day in 2011, after finishing his shift at the bar, late at night and closing the place, Dan would usually go home, but he had a habit of going out with friends for drinks after work. That means he finished his work at one bar to go to another, where he and his friends would drink. On that particular day, Dan was out with his close friend Mark, and they went to a bar in a hotel. There, they sat drinking and getting drunk. When it got late, Mark decided to go home, leaving Dan alone. Dan was supposed to return home too, especially since it was already past midnight, but he wanted to drink more. When he took out his wallet to order, he found it empty, and his friend Mark was not there to pay for him. So, where could he get money from? Now, while intoxicated, Dan left the bar searching for an ATM. After a while, he found a machine belonging to the National Australia Bank, NAB, where he had an account. It was 12:10 in the night. Dan had two cards, a savings account card, where he kept his money, and a credit card, which he could use to borrow money. First, he inserted his savings account card into the ATM, but unfortunately, the savings account was empty with a balance of 0, so he was left with only his credit card. Most of you probably know how credit cards work. They allow you to borrow money from the bank up to a maximum limit. The maximum limit for Dan's credit card was $2,000. The problem was that he knew he was close to this limit since he had been spending in the negative with this card all month. Regardless, he decided to check and inserted his credit card into the machine. Indeed, his account showed a negative balance of $1,995, meaning he had only $5 left before reaching his credit card's maximum limit. But being drunk at that moment, he decided to try transferring $200 from his credit card to his savings account. He pressed the buttons on the ATM, entered $200 in the transfer field, and pressed confirm. Normally, the machine should have rejected the transaction since the credit card had nearly reached its credit limit, leaving only $5 available. And indeed, this is what happened. An error message appeared on the screen stating that the transaction was incorrect and the machine automatically ejected the credit card. At this point, any sober person would take their cards and go home, understanding that the transaction had failed. How could one expect to transfer $200 from a credit card to a savings account when the credit card had already reached its maximum limit? It's a logical thought, but since Dan was intoxicated, he decided to insert his savings account card into the ATM to see if the $200 had been transferred. As mentioned, the savings account was supposed to be empty, showing a 0 balance. However, curiously, the machine did not display the account balance. The screen read, "Account balance is currently unavailable." Puzzled as to why the balance wasn't showing, especially when it should have been 0, Dan nonetheless went to the withdrawal option, entered $200, and pressed confirm. Instead of an error message or a notification of insufficient funds, the ATM dispensed $200 in cash, money seemingly from thin air, implying that the funds he tried to transfer from the credit card had indeed moved to his savings account. Even though the credit card should have been maxed out, where did this money come from and how was it transferred, especially when the initial attempt to transfer $200 resulted in an error message? Drunk as he was, Dan didn't ponder how this happened. All he thought about was returning to the bar to drink more. So he took the money and went back to the bar, staying there until around 12:50. Leaving the bar, Dan walked towards his home. That night, it was raining heavily, so he sought shelter to wait out the rain and found himself again in front of the same ATM from which he had withdrawn the $200. The machine was covered, providing shelter from the rain, so he stood under the cover next to the ATM. Even though he was drunk, he began to contemplate what had happened. How did the machine dispense $200 when he shouldn't have been able to transfer any amount from his credit card? In that moment, he decided to try the same action again. First, Dan inserted his savings account card into the ATM and encountered the same issue. The balance was not displayed, with a message stating that the account balance could not be shown at the moment. He then took out the savings account card, inserted his credit card, and attempted again to transfer $200 from the credit card to the savings account. The same error message appeared, stating the transaction was incorrect and the credit card was automatically ejected from the machine. Dan then reinserted the savings account card into the ATM, and although the balance still wasn't showing, he went straight to the withdrawal option, entered $200, and pressed confirm. Remarkably, the machine dispensed $200 in cash once again. He repeated the process with larger amounts, $400, $800, and each time, the ATM dispensed the requested funds, even though his accounts were empty. By the end of that night, he had withdrawn approximately $2,000 and returned home with a wallet full of cash. Exhausted, Dan went straight to bed and fell asleep. The next morning, he woke up and began to recall the events. At first, he thought it was a dream, but when he opened his wallet and saw the $2,000, he realized it had happened. Surprised, the first thing he thought to do was check his bank balances, as the ATM the previous night had not displayed his account balance. Upon checking, he found his savings account balance was still zero, and his credit card showed a negative balance of $1,995, just as before. It seemed as if the accounts remained unchanged, as if he had withdrawn $2,000 out of nothing. So, he decided to wait and see if the bank would contact him. Dan thought something might happen, like the police suddenly knocking on his door. But that day passed without any incident. No one inquired about him or contacted him. The next morning arrived, after more than 24 hours since the withdrawal incident. Upon waking, Dan's first action was to check his account balance, realizing he needed to contact the bank. He called the bank and requested a statement to know his balance. To his surprise, the balance in his savings account was now negative $2,000. The credit card account still showed a negative balance of $1,995, but the savings account had dropped from zero to negative $2,000. This meant that the withdrawals he made from the savings account were reflected and turned negative. In other words, the system corrected itself. The $2,000 he withdrew from the ATM became a debt in his account, even though such an occurrence should not have happened in the first place. The strange thing Dan noticed after the account statement was that the transfers he made did not appear. It didn't show that he transferred the money from his credit card to his savings account. The statement only showed that the savings account balance had become negative $2,000, as if the system didn't know where the money came from. It recognized the withdrawal, but not its source. At this point, Dan should have returned the $2,000 to the bank to cover his debt. However, after opening his wallet and seeing the cash, he thought it better to have money in hand than a zero balance in the bank, even if it meant his account was in the negative. So, he went shopping, bought household items, even a new refrigerator for the kitchen, and later invited his friends to the bar where he worked. By the end of it, he had only $300 left from the $2,000. Rather than returning it to the bank to cover some of his debt, he decided to gamble it in the hope of recovering the amount he had spent and paying off his debt to the bank. Betting on horse races is common in Australia, especially in bars. The bar where Dan worked was one of the establishments that partnered with Tab, the largest horse race betting site in Australia. Customers would give cash to the bar owner, who would then place bets on the site, as the bar was connected to the system. Dan decided to bet the remaining $300 on horse races. Unfortunately, by the end of the day, he lost all $300 and returned home empty-handed and in debt to the bank. Now he pondered what to do about his predicament and reflected on that night when he managed to withdraw $2,000 from the ATM. Although Dan had issues with drinking and gambling, he possessed a certain intelligence and a passion for understanding technical systems. He wasn't a hacker, but he had a curiosity about how systems work. He began to consider all the factors from that night, and one crucial factor he identified was the timing. The withdrawal happened after midnight, so he decided to try the same action again after midnight. A few days later, after finishing his shift at the bar, he went to the same ATM. First, he inserted his savings account card, and indeed, it showed a balance of negative $2,000. Then, he inserted his credit card, which also had a negative balance of $1,995. As previously mentioned, his credit card was near its maximum credit limit, but Dan decided to repeat the process. This time, he attempted to transfer $1,000 from his credit card to his savings account. The same error message appeared, indicating the transaction was incorrect and the credit card was automatically ejected from the ATM. He then inserted his savings account card and found, to his surprise, that the balance was now negative $1,000, meaning the $1,000 he transferred from the credit card had been credited to the savings account, despite this being an impossible occurrence. Again, he tried transferring another $1,000 from his credit card. The error message reappeared, but when he checked his savings account, the balance had returned to zero, effectively clearing the debt he owed within minutes. Dan was aware that the system might correct itself later and revert his account to a negative $2,000 balance. Nevertheless, he decided to try withdrawing money once again. He attempted to transfer $2,000 from his credit card to his savings account. As expected, the error message appeared, but when he checked the savings account, the balance showed $2,000. He withdrew this amount, resetting the savings account balance to zero. Dan returned home with an additional $2,000 in his pocket, and his account balance was zero. However, he knew the system might eventually correct itself, and he wanted to know exactly when this correction would take place. He slept that night and called the bank the next morning. The balance was still zero. Throughout that day, he repeatedly called the bank for an account statement, always receiving the same result, a zero balance. Even at night, the balance remained zero. The following morning, he called the bank again, and this time, there was a change. Suddenly, the balance was negative $4,000. The system had corrected all the withdrawals he had made. He had withdrawn $2,000 on the first night and another $2,000 on the second night, totaling a negative balance of $4,000. This situation led to the realization that this tactic was not beneficial in the long run. Although he could withdraw cash, the bank would eventually notice when his account reached significant negative amounts. The bank had an automatic system in place. If an account reached a negative balance of $20,000, it would be frozen immediately, and the bank would surely take notice. However, the loophole Dan discovered was that this correction process took more than a full day. He theorized that after midnight, the bank's ATM entered a standby mode, disconnected from the main banking system from midnight to 1 a.m. This was why the money was able to be transferred from the credit card to the savings account, despite it being a system flaw. Given that the correction took more than 24 hours, Dan figured that if he performed the transfer every night between midnight and 1 a.m., he could offset the negative balance from the previous day. For instance, if he withdrew $2,000 one night before it turned negative in his account, he could transfer another $2,000 the next night. By doing this each night, his account would remain at zero because the correction took more than 24 hours. The strategy required him to transfer and withdraw funds every night, continuously adding to the total amount. For example, if Dan withdrew $10,000 one night, the following night he would need to transfer $20,000 to withdraw $10,000 and compensate for the previous night's $10,000. And if he wanted to withdraw $10,000 again on the third night, he would have to transfer $30,000 to cover the cumulative total. The amount he needed to transfer each night would accumulate. Interestingly, the ATM allowed him to transfer any six-figure amount, meaning he could transfer up to $999,000 in one transaction, and if needed, he could simply perform another transfer. However, he had to make these transfers every night. Missing even one night would result in all the money he had withdrawn in previous nights turning negative in his account. For example, if he had withdrawn a total of $100,000 over several nights, his account would suddenly reflect a negative $100,000, and the bank would immediately notice due to the large amount. In summary, the idea was that Dan had to transfer funds every night to maintain this cycle. He even discovered that he could perform this operation at any of the bank's ATMs. So, he lived his life going to the ATM every night and withdrawing significant amounts of money. According to him, he felt a bit guilty, but then rationalized that he wasn't stealing from any specific person, but taking money from the bank's funds. Dan viewed the bank as a malevolent institution that stole people's money, so he rationalized why he shouldn't take advantage of this opportunity to steal from them. This was the logic he used to justify his actions to himself. Of course, he told no one about this. It was a closely guarded secret, not shared with his friends or even his fiancée. Within the first week, he had withdrawn about $20,000. He particularly enjoyed treating his friends to drinks and betting on horse races. His friends would encourage him and even help him choose the horses to bet on. He was living life and having fun, sometimes even treating everyone at the bar and declaring that he would cover the bill. People around him began to wonder where he was getting all this money from, as they knew his financial situation didn't allow for such extravagance. His explanation was that he was winning big on his horse race bets, a seemingly logical explanation that everyone believed. However, in reality, he was incurring terrible losses in his bets and had become addicted to gambling. He kept losing money until his losses amounted to $40,000. When Dan came to work one day, he found the manager on a call with the betting site's administration. They were explaining to the manager that this employee was making insanely high bets, and they even suspected that he might be scamming them. The suspicion was that he was accepting the bet money, but not depositing the corresponding amounts in the safe. However, the bar owner personally checked the safe and found the money there. The amount of money Dan was handling astounded the bar owner. Imagine that Dan was betting in a single day what the bar would typically make from bets in an entire month. Naturally, such large sums raised suspicions. Consequently, the betting site closed his account and prohibited him from placing any further bets. The bar owner, suspecting something illegal, fired Dan. Everyone suspected he might be involved in illegal activities, with drug dealing being the first thing that came to their minds. Consequently, they severed all ties with him, and Dan, who no longer needed the job, was left jobless. In a small town where everyone knows each other, news spreads quickly. Word about Dan reached his fiancée, who ended their relationship with a text message, stating she didn't want to be associated with whatever he was involved in, and declaring their relationship over. Feeling the need to confide in someone, Dan reached out to his closest friend, Mark, and told him about the loophole he found in the bank's ATM system that allowed him to withdraw money. Mark told him he didn't want to get involved in the matter, but assured Dan that it wouldn't affect their friendship. Dan suggested they take a vacation, and Mark agreed. They took a train to Melbourne and stayed at the Crown Towers, a luxurious 5-star hotel. Dan stood in front of the room's large window overlooking the city, and for the first time felt the richness of his newfound wealth, realizing the life he could lead with money. However, even that night, he had to find an ATM to make his daily transfer. He couldn't miss a single night. The following day, Dan and Mark went to the casino in the hotel and gambled thousands of dollars, moving from game to game, losing more and more each time. But the money didn't matter to them. It seemed endless. Night after night, they went down to the casino, spending more in a few days than they would earn in a year. After a few days, Mark had to return to Wangaratta for work, while Dan decided to stay in Melbourne. The only limitation Dan faced was the withdrawal limit from the ATM, as the amount he could withdraw was restricted by the cash available in the machine, which typically didn't contain huge sums. So, Dan decided to attempt a bold move. His account balance had soared to $500,000 within the first month. To withdraw a significant amount, like $100,000, he had to go inside the bank, which was a daunting prospect since he knew he was essentially stealing. He was always afraid that the bank would notice his activities and that he might suddenly receive a call from them or even find himself wanted by the police. Going to the bank to withdraw money required extraordinary courage. After a few days of hesitation, Dan decided to try, but knew he had to be cautious and smart, starting gradually. The first time, He planned to request a withdrawal of $1,000, an amount he could easily withdraw from the ATM. His primary aim was to gauge the bank's reaction. Nervously, he entered the bank, approached the teller, provided his identification, and requested a withdrawal of $1,000. The teller complied and handed him the money. Dan casually inquired about his account balance, and the teller, checking the system, informed him that he had $537,327. Encouraged by the smooth transaction, he next withdrew a larger sum, $20,000. Everything went smoothly again, and he left the bank without any issues. On his third visit, Dan decided to withdraw a substantial amount of $100,000. This time, before giving him the cash, the teller went inside, likely to get approval from the manager. The wait was lengthy, and Dan was on edge the entire time, fearing they had discovered his scheme and were calling the police. However, after about 15 minutes, the teller returned and handed him the complete amount in cash, $100,000. Now Dan was no longer limited by the amount he could withdraw from the ATM. He could directly withdraw any amount he desired from the bank. Despite everything, he was convinced that his deception would eventually be uncovered. So, he decided to make the most of this opportunity and enjoy the money he had while he could, knowing that one day he would likely be caught and face a lengthy prison sentence. He called a group of friends, including his close friend Mark, and told them to take time off work and join him. He promised to book them into the most luxurious hotels, dine at the finest restaurants, and experience things they had never dreamed of. His friends, initially surprised and aware of the unusual nature of his offer, eventually agreed. The group, including Dan, Mark, and two others whose names and identities were unknown, were all in on the extravagant spending spree. Dan confided the details of his bank ATM loophole to one of the two, explaining the entire situation. The last friend preferred not to know the specifics, choosing to enjoy the experiences without being involved in the larger issue, fearing the risks of complicity. With two of his friends now aware of the scheme and the third simply along for the ride, the four of them spent lavishly. They traveled exclusively in limousines and sometimes even used helicopters for trips to restaurants or bars. Dan was known for generously treating everyone at the bar or restaurant, telling the staff to put the entire bill on him. Whenever they met someone who seemed to fit in with their vibe, they would invite them to join their parties. Sometimes, Dan would rent entire hotel swimming pools for parties, or even penthouses and whole floors of hotels, turning these into grand celebrations. This extravagant lifestyle was the norm for them during this period. Dan was incredibly generous, giving money and substantial tips to anyone he encountered, with his friends naturally topping the list. He would buy them anything they desired and even pay off all their debts, including their substantial student loans. In one incident, as Dan was walking down the street, he saw a guitarist playing for passersby, but noticed that no one was stopping to listen. Dan paid for people to assemble around the performer because the music moved him, and he then gave the musician thousands of dollars. In another incident, while dining at a restaurant, Dan met an elderly couple who had dreamed of traveling to Hawaii but couldn't afford it due to their financial constraints. They had resigned themselves to a domestic trip within Australia. Dan gave them $40,000 in cash to make their dream trip to Hawaii a reality. One of the activities Dan also engaged in was walking the streets and finding homeless people or those without a place to stay and accommodating them in luxurious hotels for the night. This act brought him a kind of happiness, especially when he saw their reactions, and at the same time, it helped alleviate the guilt he felt. He might have seen himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. However, he didn't hold back on spending for himself and his friends either. They would visit the most upscale clothing stores and buy the most expensive items, including high-end perfumes. On one occasion, he had booked a table at one of the city's most expensive restaurants. After they finished their meal, Dan paid the bill for all the tables in the restaurant, even though the patrons of such establishments typically don't need someone else to pay for them. One of the staff members inquired about his generosity and found out if he was the richest person in Australia. Dan replied, "No, there are people richer than me. I'm probably in 7th place." Despite all the partying, dining, bar hopping, shopping, and the whirlwind lifestyle, Dan had to ensure he made the transfers from the ATM every night. Missing even one night would mean the end of everything. He set alarms on his phone for just before midnight, the loudest possible, to remind him to quickly go to the ATM and complete his transactions between 12 and 1 o'clock. In just 4 months, he had withdrawn over $1 million from the bank, which remained unaware of the ongoing exploitation. You might wonder, how could he spend over $1 million in 4 months? For instance, there was a time when he rented a private plane for $90,000 and flew to an island near Bali in Indonesia, renting the entire island for 2 days. During this trip, he entrusted one of his friends with his bank cards to make the transfers. He kept calling his friend throughout the trip to ensure the transactions were completed. Throughout these 4 months, Dan was convinced he would be caught eventually. Any day, the bank could notice the irregularities and alert the police. Despite enjoying the money and lavish lifestyle, he lived in constant fear and anxiety. Unable to find peace in sleep, he often drowned his worries in alcohol. After living 4 tumultuous months filled with constant anxiety and fear, Dan reached his breaking point. He could no longer cope with the psychological pressure, compounded by a growing sense of guilt and self-reproach. He had spent far more money than he could fathom. Gathering his 3 friends, Dan announced his decision to stop. He felt overwhelmed by the immense psychological burden, which had become unbearable. Initially disappointed but understanding, his friends listened as he explained his plan for one final withdrawal. He offered them whatever they desired, whether cash or purchases. He conducted this last transaction, distributing what his friends wanted. By the end of this final act, Dan had withdrawn a total of $1,600,000 from the bank. For the first time in 4 months, Dan didn't go to the ATM that night and didn't perform the transfers. Consequently, the entire sum of $1,600,000 would now reflect as a negative balance in his account. His friends said their goodbyes and returned to their small town, while Dan stayed behind in the hotel, left with about $80,000 in cash. He kept this amount in the bathroom of his hotel room, resigned to his room, expecting at any moment to receive a call from the bank, or perhaps suddenly, to have the police burst into his room and arrest him. Now that his account showed a negative balance of $1,600,000. Indeed, a few days later, Dan received a call from the bank. When he answered, they informed him of unusual activities in his account and asked if he could explain what was happening. Dan feigned ignorance, saying that he doesn't know and they probably know better. The bank responded that they would investigate the matter and get back to him, warning that if they found he was doing something wrong, they would file a report with the police and cautioning him against trying to flee or avoid them. Dan acknowledged their message and stayed in the hotel, waiting day after day. A whole month passed without any further contact from the bank. Eventually, tired of waiting, Dan decided to call the bank himself to inquire about the situation. A female employee answered, and he explained that he had been waiting for a month for a response regarding his account, but had heard nothing. The employee asked him to hold, and he waited for over 20 minutes. Then, a man named Bernie, apparently a manager or official at the bank, came on the line. Bernie bluntly told Dan, "You're not getting any more money, and I think you know why." Dan replied that he didn't want any money. He just wanted to know what was happening. Bernie tersely said, "You're a bad boy," and informed him that the matter had been handed over to the police, who were now investigating. Bernie concluded by telling Dan that he had ruined his life. Following that call, Dan was certain that the police would arrive at any moment to arrest him. So, he stayed in his hotel room, waiting. However, once again, a whole month passed without any news from the bank, the police, or anyone else. Dan decided to leave Melbourne and return to his small town, especially since the cash he had was running low. He went back to Wangaratta and continued to wait there, expecting a call or a summons from the police, but months passed, and nothing happened. During these months, there was ongoing communication between him and the bank, with the bank continuously threatening his arrest and imprisonment. But, incredibly, 1 year passed, then 2, and nothing materialized. It was as if the bank was tormenting him with threats, but taking no action. This prolonged state of anxiety and fear continued, and Dan even consulted some lawyers to discuss his case and understand his legal standing. However, even the lawyers couldn't offer much help because his case was unprecedented and unique. He continued to wait, enduring the bank's ongoing threats. For 2 years, the bank kept calling Dan, stating that the matter was under investigation and that he would be imprisoned. Dan felt trapped, unable to live his life normally, uncertain whether the bank was just playing games with him or genuinely unable to initiate any legal action. By the early part of 2014, more than 2 years since he began his activities, Dan reached a breaking point. He could no longer bear the pressure of living under constant threat, neither imprisoned nor free. In an attempt to provoke some kind of response from the bank and bring closure to his ordeal, Dan made a bold decision. He turned to the media and began to share his story publicly. Initially, Dan reached out to one of the most prominent newspapers in Australia and shared his story with them. They were intrigued and invited him for an interview. A journalist worked with him, even arranging for him to wear a suit and be photographed in a private plane for the article to be published in the newspaper. When the article was published and Dan's story was exposed to the public for the first time, it didn't gain the expected traction or provoke a significant reaction from the bank. Determined to escalate the matter, Dan then contacted a program called Current Affair, one of the most popular television shows in Australia. The producers and creators of the show found Dan's story compelling and invited him for a week-long filming session. They rented a hotel, cars, and a plane to capture shots representing Dan's extravagant 4 months living off the bank's money. After filming the episode, Dan waited for several weeks while it was edited and prepared for broadcast. Dan believed that once his story had aired on Current Affair, the bank would have to respond because it was a very well-liked program with millions of viewers. Dan eagerly awaited the television premiere, watching the first broadcast. The report summarized his story, not delving into all the details, but sufficiently explaining the situation. However, at the end of the story, the presenter made a surprising announcement. She stated that there was an arrest warrant for Dan, and he was now considered a fugitive. Anyone with knowledge of his whereabouts was urged to inform the police. Dan was astounded and perplexed by the turn of events as he watched it happen. Dan was in disbelief at how the producers of the show, who were supposed to be professional journalists, fabricated a story about him being a fugitive just to make the narrative more sensational. On the same night the program aired, one of the show's producers emailed Dan. The producer expressed pleasure in having met Dan, complimenting him as a charming person, and hoping he was satisfied with the final product. He informed Dan that if he wanted to collect the photos and documents related to the shots they filmed, he could visit the television station the following Thursday. Dan immediately sensed something amiss, but was puzzled as to why they were orchestrating these fabrications. Regardless, he wanted to resolve the matter once and for all. When Thursday arrived, Dan went to the television station. As he entered the building, he was surprised by a swarm of photographers surrounding him from every direction. Then, a police officer approached him and informed him that he was under arrest, all while the channel's cameras were rolling. In that moment, Dan realized why they had done all this. They had orchestrated the entire scenario for their show, aiming to conclude their story with his dramatic arrest, portraying themselves as the heroes who had trapped and captured the criminal. Despite Dan spending all this time waiting for the bank or the police to take action, and even proactively reaching out and engaging with the television program himself, this situation illustrates how the media can sometimes be a murky place, depending on the people working in it. When Dan was arrested, the police officer who apprehended him took him to the station, where they processed his fingerprints. Surprisingly, without any formal interrogation or interview, he was immediately placed in detention. After a lawyer was appointed for Dan, the lawyer revealed some unbelievable information. The first revelation was that the police officer who arrested Dan was not an officer who had been investigating the case. The television show's producer, who was friends with the police officer, personally contacted the officer to come and make the arrest. This meant the officer was essentially performing for the cameras without any actual knowledge of the case. The entire arrest was based solely on the story presented in the TV program, where Dan confessed to his actions. The police hadn't been investigating the matter at all, and there was no open case to begin with. The bank had not reported the issue to the police, revealing that their threats were merely hollow. Dan realized that the bank didn't want to expose a flaw in their systems that allowed someone to steal more than $1.6 million. If this became public, the customers would lose faith in the bank, possibly switching to another one, and the bank's shares would plummet, leading to losses far exceeding the amount stolen. Dan only fully understood this after his arrest. The bank, even after his arrest, refused to be involved in the case, as doing so would require them to disclose their records and accounts. This would have been a major scandal for them, revealing that a system error allowed the massive theft. The case had to go to court because someone confessed on television to stealing money. However, the bank refused to participate, and the prosecutor took over the case. If the bank had been involved, and the full details came to light, it would have been a scandal for them. But likely Dan would have faced much longer imprisonment. However, due to the bank's refusal to get involved, and the unclear details of the case, to the extent that even the judge and prosecutor didn't fully understand what happened or how the money was stolen, Dan was sentenced to only 1 year in prison. After serving his sentence, he was released, and has since appeared in TV interviews and started writing a book about his story. In one interview, when asked if he kept any of the money he withdrew before his imprisonment, Dan declined to comment. The amount that Dan withdrew from the bank might even be more than $1.6 million. In the end, this figure is just what he declared. Since the bank didn't release any numbers from their side, the actual amount could be higher. This was the astonishing and bizarre story of Dan Sanders. I want to hear from you honestly. If you discovered an error like this in a bank machine, what would you do? And with that, we've come to the end of our story. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Here are some other amazing videos you can watch. That's all for now. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.